HOA, Karen shot my disabled daughter. She didn't know I'm a federal judge. The sirens were the first thing the neighbors noticed. Then the screaming. Then the blood. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon in the suburbs. Trimmed lawns, kids on scooters, the distant sound of lawnmowers. But that day, everything broke. A little girl lay in the grass, her jeans soaked through with blood. Her golden retriever, frantic, barked and snapped, circling her body like a soldier refusing to abandon his post. She was 12. Her name was Maya. Her mother, Helen, dropped to her knees beside her, barefoot and shaking, pressing her hands into the wounds, whispering over and over, "Stay with me, baby." Paramedics moved quickly, but time felt frozen. Phones were recording. Neighbors watched, frozen at their doors, some in tears, some in shock, none of them fast enough. You're watching Cracks of Light, the channel where real stories shine through the darkest moments. If this is your first time here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every story we share is rooted in truth, shaped by justice, and delivered with heart. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's not an exaggerated headline. It's what happens when power is abused, silence is weaponized, and one woman decides that enough is enough. Maya had been shot twice. The bullets entered just above the knee and exited out the back of her thighs. She didn't scream, not until she saw her mother's face. That's where her voice cracked. "Mom, I can't feel my legs." The ambulance door slammed. Helen stood in the driveway, covered in her daughter's blood, watching the lights fade down the street. Just moments before, Maya had been sitting on the back patio with earbuds in, giggling at Charlie, the dog, chasing butterflies. Helen was chopping vegetables in the kitchen, listening to a podcast. Peaceful, normal, until Deborah Wilkins, the head of the HOA, stepped onto their lawn with a gun in her handbag and a fire in her eyes. Helen never saw the confrontation, not until it was too late. Deborah had shouted something about the dog, something about the wheelchair. Then the shots rang out. The neighborhood had always looked pristine on the surface. Brick facades, tidy mailboxes, smiling faces at block parties. But beneath the decorum, Helen had sensed something off from the moment they moved in. A chill that didn't come from the weather. She chalked it up to awkward small talk, the discomfort people have when they see a child in a wheelchair. But it wasn't that. It was deeper, more targeted. And Deborah, polished, politically connected, obsessed with control, had made herself the gatekeeper of that discomfort. Maya's presence, her ramp, her service dog, they didn't fit the image Deborah curated for the neighborhood. And so the harassment began. Petty at first. Notes about trash bins, about flower pots, about the dog being too big. Then it escalated. Scratch cars, slashed tires, surveillance. And still, Helen held her peace. Because Helen wasn't just Maya's mom. She was also a federal judge. A woman who had sentenced war criminals, ruled on constitutional law, and fought for civil rights her entire career. But she never wanted to wield that power in her own home. She believed in process, in letting people show who they are. Deborah showed her, and the moment she pulled that trigger, she declared war on the wrong mother. This isn't just a story about a neighborhood dispute gone too far. It's about what happens when people underestimate a woman who's been quiet too long. When a system built to protect is turned against those who need it most. When a mother stops asking politely. So before we take you into the courtroom, before the headlines and the trial, we're starting here. With blood in the grass, a girl in pain, and a mother who is about to remind the world that justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes, it kneels in the dirt and whispers, "Not my child." Subscribe now, because what comes next will shake every assumption you've made about power, privilege, and the quiet fury of a woman who knows the law, and now has nothing left to lose. Before the sirens, before the blood, before Helen Blake's name made national headlines, there was only hope. Quiet, measured, cautious hope. The kind of hope that comes from surviving too much, too fast for too long. Helen didn't need perfection. She just wanted peace. And for a brief moment, she believed she had found it. Haven Hills was a planned community on the outskirts of a wealthy suburb. Gated, manicured, and predictably proud of itself. Helen had reviewed it like she did every case file, thoroughly. Good school ratings, clean crime report, diversity statement buried in the HOA paperwork that hinted at progress. But what mattered most was Maya. Her 12-year-old daughter had spent the last 2 years adapting to a world that no longer moved with her. After a drunk driver ran a red light and crushed their car, Maya survived. Her legs didn't. The crash changed everything. But Maya didn't surrender. Neither did Helen. Helen had spent a career in federal courtrooms, becoming known not just for her sharp legal mind, but for her ability to stay composed under pressure. She handled hate crime cases with the same exacting care she applied to high-level corruption trials. She knew how power moved. She knew how to detect bias in polished statements, how to dissect subtle threats masked as policy. She saw in the courtroom every day, but in her personal life, she craved simplicity. Her last home, a busy downtown loft, had once symbolized achievement. Now it was a maze of sharp corners and heavy doors, a daily reminder of everything Maya had to fight through. So when the opportunity came to move out of the city, to somewhere with wide sidewalks and step-free entries, Helen made the call. Haven Hills wasn't just about fresh air and trimmed hedges. It was about giving Maya a new kind of normal. Their arrival was quiet. No moving van. No fuss. Just Helen's SUV and 2 weeks of meticulous planning. She had already sent the HOA a heads-up about the temporary accessibility ramp and attached ADA compliance documents for good measure. The ramp wasn't fancy. Lightweight, removable, practical. It allowed Maya to enter the house on her own, and that mattered. Everything Helen did was about giving her daughter pieces of her independence back. Maya didn't want pity. She wanted access. She wanted her own space to paint, to read, to sit with Charlie, their golden retriever therapy dog, and listen to music under the sun. Helen had chosen their lot specifically for the backyard. Level ground, shaded trees, enough space to feel free without being exposed. At first, it felt like the right decision. The neighbors smiled. Some waved. A woman 2 doors down brought cookies, though she never made eye contact with Maya. A man jogging with his dog nodded each morning for the first week and then never again. Helen noticed the way their smiles faltered when Maya rolled past on the sidewalk, the way conversations paused and then resumed 2 beats too late. She told herself it was nothing. Change makes people awkward. They'll come around. They always do. She gave people the benefit of the doubt, the way she'd taught juries to look beyond surface impressions. Besides, Maya seemed happy. She loved the house. She named the ramp the launch pad. She painted it with sunflowers and stars. She started a garden with Helen in the corner of the yard. For once, their lives had a rhythm that wasn't centered around hospital visits or legal paperwork. Helen worked from home more. She finally unpacked boxes that had followed them from 3 addresses ago. It was quiet. It was soft. It was starting to feel like healing. Maya even started inviting a friend from physical therapy over on weekends. The girl's name was Jada, and she had a sharp laugh and the kind of confidence Helen admired. The 2 of them made TikToks in the backyard. They played chess. They argued about music. Maya smiled again. Not just polite smiles, but real ones. Charlie followed them around like a furry shadow, always alert, always protective. Helen would watch from the kitchen window and, for a little while, believe that maybe, just maybe, they had made it out the other side. Then came the first note. It was folded neatly and tucked under the doormat. Please ensure all exterior structures have been approved by the HOA board. Signed only with an H. No name. No welcome. Just the first breath of pressure disguised as process. Helen didn't panic. She had prepared for this. She sent a cordial reply, attached documents, cited compliance codes. She even followed up with a phone call to the board chair, Deborah Wilkins, to clarify their understanding. Deborah's voice was smooth but firm. She claimed the board simply needed to ensure uniformity and that the ramp wasn't in keeping with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Helen reminded her that the ADA trumped aesthetics. Deborah paused, then said, "Of course, we're just trying to keep everything pleasant." The way she said the word pleasant made Helen's spine stiffen. But she didn't push. Not yet. Weeks passed. More notes came. Different handwriting. One claimed Charlie had barked during quiet hours, though Helen and Maya had been out of town that weekend. Another cited an excess of front porch items and included a photo of Maya's small flower pots. Helen replied to each one, careful, professional, determined not to escalate. She didn't want to teach Maya that every disagreement had to become a battle, but she also wouldn't teach her to fold under unfairness. She had built a career teaching people the difference between power and abuse. And even though she hadn't yet said it out loud, Helen knew this wasn't about rules. It was about presence, about control, about someone like Deborah not wanting to be told no by someone like her. Still, she held back. Let it play out. Maybe the board would tire of pushing. Maybe the neighbors would realize who she was and think better. But Deborah didn't back off. She started showing up. Sometimes when Helen was parking. Sometimes when Maya was outside. She always smiled, always offered something that sounded like a suggestion but felt like a warning. And Helen began to notice who stood with Deborah and who stood silent. The line was forming, even if no one would admit it. Helen tried to protect Maya from it all. She kept the letters out of sight. She reassured her when Maya asked why people seemed colder. She answered honestly, but carefully. She said some people have a hard time with difference. That kindness takes time, that their job was to be themselves anyway. Maya listened. She always listened, but Helen could see the shift. Maya stopped using the front sidewalk. She stopped inviting Jada over. She stayed closer to the house, closer to Charlie. It didn't take gunfire for Maya to feel unsafe. Just enough glances, enough notes, enough silence. Helen stayed up late one night reviewing the HOA bylaws again, this time not as a neighbor, but as a litigator. She highlighted every ambiguous clause, every discretionary loophole. She started a folder, a real one, not just a pile on the kitchen counter, but a digital file with dates, times, scanned documents, and screenshots. She didn't intend to use it, not unless she had to. But instincts are what kept her alive in courtrooms. And her instincts were telling her something she didn't want to say out loud. That this wasn't just about a ramp. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about the image of a black mother with authority and a black child in a wheelchair in a neighborhood obsessed with sameness. But still, even then, Helen didn't expect what came next. She didn't know yet that Deborah wasn't done, that her need to control would spiral, that all the small acts of resistance would one day explode into something unthinkable, that the girl she moved to protect would bleed out in the grass she once painted with flowers. At that point in time, all Helen knew was this. She had chosen Haven Hills to give Maya a future, and she would do anything, absolutely anything, to defend it. Underneath every polished neighborhood is a quiet war, and Deborah Wilkins had been winning hers for years. On paper, she was the president of the Haven Hills Homeowners Association, a title that sounded more like a formality than a crown. In reality, it was the seat of power she wielded with surgical precision. Rules weren't just guidelines in her hands. They were weapons. Language wasn't just for communication. It was camouflage. She didn't shout. She didn't curse. She wrote in cursive. She signed her emails with warmly. And that was exactly what made her dangerous. The first real interaction Helen had with Deborah was civil. Too civil. Deborah showed up in a neatly pressed cream blazer, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched atop her styled blonde hair like a permanent accessory. She smiled, barely, and gestured toward the ramp. "Just a friendly note," she said. "I noticed the structure out front. We usually ask for prior approval for things like that. You know, to keep everything harmonious." Helen explained, without raising her voice, that the ramp was a temporary ADA-compliant structure, not subject to architectural approval. Deborah's smile didn't move. "Of course," she said. "We just try to make sure nothing stands out too much." For consistency, it was the beginning of a pattern Helen would come to know intimately. Deborah didn't argue. She documented. She didn't confront. She filed. And she never attacked directly. She always hid behind the bylaws. Shortly after that exchange, Maya's therapy dog, Charlie, became a problem. Deborah left a note. Neatly typed, folded, no signature. Concern has been raised about animal size and proximity to children. Please ensure your pet is not off-leash. Charlie had never been off-leash. Helen replied in writing, attaching Charlie's official service animal documentation. No response. A week later, another note, this time citing unapproved outdoor furniture. It referred to a lightweight bench Maya used to practice transfers from her chair. Helen didn't react. Not yet. But Maya noticed. "Why don't they like us?" she asked one night, sitting at the edge of her bed. Helen gave the same answer she'd always given. Some people struggle with difference. But she didn't believe it anymore. It wasn't difference they struggled with. It was the refusal to be invisible. The reports escalated. A violation for decorative clutter on the front porch, potted herbs. A warning about noise, the soft hum of Maya's wheelchair ramp being lowered at night. Helen began to suspect she was being watched. The timing of the complaints was too precise, too aligned with their routines. She asked the HOA for camera access, citing her right as a resident. The reply came back delayed, bureaucratic, and incomplete. The footage for the days in question was unavailable due to maintenance. Helen didn't argue. She bought her own cameras, quietly installed. No announcement, no warning. Deborah didn't know she was being recorded. Not yet. But Helen was done playing defense. At school, Maya changed. Her posture, her energy. She stopped mentioning friends. When Helen asked about Jada, Maya shrugged. She said her mom didn't want her walking here alone anymore. Another girl stopped responding to texts. Then another. Helen checked the HOA community forum, a members-only site moderated by Deborah. There were passive-aggressive posts about neighborhood safety, changes in tone, and community standards. No names, just enough implication to plant suspicion. Helen recognized the strategy. Create discomfort. Nurture it. Then let it do the damage on its own. Then came the letter. Not HOA branded. Not typed. Handwritten in block letters. Maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for your kind. Folded neatly, slid under the doormat. No name. No return address. But Helen didn't need one. The ink may not have been Deborah's, but the culture of silence and compliance that gave it breath, that was her design. Helen filed a report. Police came, took a statement, shrugged. Hard to trace, they said. Helen didn't expect more. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted acknowledgement. The neighborhood gave her none. Deborah remained cordial in emails, passive in meetings, polite in public. But every time Helen looked at her, she saw calculation. She started seeing Deborah in places she didn't belong. Standing at the end of their driveway, walking slowly past Maya's bedroom window, pretending to check mail. At 10 p.m., Helen confronted her once. Asked if there was something she needed. Deborah smiled. Just getting my steps in. Lovely night, isn't it? That smile, tight, sanitized, rehearsed, made Helen's blood boil. But she didn't raise her voice. Deborah thrived on reactions. So Helen gave her none. Not yet. One day, Maya came home from school quieter than usual. She didn't eat dinner. When Helen finally got her talk, Maya confessed that a group of kids had laughed at her for using the ramp. They said their parents don't want them using the sidewalk in front of our house. Helen asked if they said why. Maya looked away. They said we don't belong here. The next morning, Helen took a photo of every note, every violation slip, every letter. She cataloged them, time-stamped them, cross-referenced them with the HOA guidelines. She didn't just build a file. She built a case. Deborah didn't stop. The next HOA meeting included a motion, subtly worded, to review non-permanent exterior modifications. Helen attended. She didn't speak until Deborah tried to call for a vote. Then, in a voice measured and composed, Helen stood and cited 3 federal statutes, 2 state protections, and the HOA's own conflict clause. Deborah's face held. Her hands tightened. The motion failed. Helen didn't smile. She didn't need to. But the room got quieter. Eyes shifted. People began to realize they hadn't just underestimated a mother. They had underestimated a professional. But for Deborah, it wasn't over. The cameras Helen installed began catching patterns. Deborah pacing, pointing, photographing. One clip showed her whispering to another board member and laughing as she gestured toward the Blake home. Helen saved it all. She still hoped it wouldn't escalate. Still hoped Maya wouldn't pay the price for someone else's need for control. But somewhere deep down, she knew Deborah wasn't going to stop until someone made her. And Helen, who had once believed law was enough to protect the vulnerable, was beginning to understand that sometimes the law needed someone willing to enforce it, not from behind a bench, but from the front lines. Not someday. Now. It was the kind of afternoon Helen had longed for. The kind where everything felt normal, even if only on the surface. Maya had finished her physical therapy session that morning, and despite the usual fatigue, she was in good spirits. Charlie was at her side, tail wagging, trotting beside her wheelchair as they moved to the backyard. Music played low from a small speaker, and Helen, from the kitchen, could see her daughter laughing as the dog chased butterflies through the grass. For a fleeting moment, the world felt light again. Maya looked free, alive, unafraid. Helen turned back to the cutting board, focused on preparing lunch, letting herself breathe into the illusion of peace. She didn't hear Deborah approach, didn't see her cross the property line, but the shouting pulled her back like a sudden rip in the air. She rushed to the window. Deborah stood at the edge of their yard, too close, gesturing sharply, her mouth moving fast, her voice carrying over the fence. Maya had taken her earbuds out, clearly confused, but not panicked. She said something calm, soft, as she always tried to be, even when she shouldn't have to. Helen wiped her hands on a towel and moved toward the door. She didn't run. Not yet. Charlie was the first to react. The dog bolted between Deborah and Maya, barking in sharp, protective bursts, his stance rigid, tail up. Deborah flinched, stepped back, but didn't leave. Instead, she reached into her purse. Helen's eyes locked on the motion. Her body froze mid-step. The sound came next, two quick cracks that tore through the air like something splitting open. Time blurred. Maya's scream was sharp and cut off. Then her body crumpled sideways, twisting unnaturally from her chair and landing on the grass with a sickening thud. Blood pooled instantly, staining her jeans, soaking into the earth beneath her. Helen sprinted. The knife she'd been holding dropped somewhere behind her. Her bare feet hit the lawn with full force, breath caught in her throat. She dropped to her knees, hands shaking as she pressed down where the blood poured out. Maya was crying, gasping but conscious. "Mom," she whispered, her lips trembling. "I can't feel my legs." Helen's heart shattered in that sentence. Her hands applied pressure, but her mind was in a different war. She screamed for help, voice raw, torn from her chest. A neighbor emerged from across the street, already dialing 911. Another brought a towel. Someone else stood filming. Deborah didn't move. She stood at the edge of the lawn, gun dangling from her hand, face blank, emotionless, as if she hadn't just fired 2 rounds into a child. The sirens came fast, too fast for anyone to process. Police, then an ambulance. Paramedics rushed in, took over. Helen's hands were covered in her daughter's blood, her knees soaked from kneeling in it. Charlie whimpered low and curled against Maya's side as they loaded her onto the stretcher. Helen tried to climb into the ambulance, but the paramedics asked her to wait. They needed space. She stood in the driveway, shaking, barely upright, staring at Deborah as the officers approached her. She didn't run. She didn't speak. When they asked for the weapon, she handed it over and said, calmly, "I felt threatened. The dog was aggressive. The girl came at me fast." One officer looked down at the blood, then at the bullet casings. The other shook his head. Helen heard the words, but couldn't process them. All she could think about was the sound of Maya's voice, the way her hand had trembled in hers, the terror in her eyes. At the hospital, everything moved in a blur. Nurses shouting codes, machines beeping, the smell of antiseptic and blood and sweat. Helen wasn't allowed past the double doors. A nurse handed her forms. She couldn't read them. Her hand still shook. Her shirt was stained red. A security guard offered to sit with Charlie. Helen sat in a plastic chair, motionless, her head pressed back against the wall, eyes open, replaying everything. Deborah's face, the gun, the sound, Maya's voice. Her daughter had already lost her legs once. And now this. A detective arrived within the hour. He recognized Helen, called her Your Honor once, then corrected himself. She didn't correct him back. He asked for a statement. Helen gave it, voice cold, precise, measured. She had done this 100 times, just never like this. She listed every interaction, Every violation, every letter. She told him about the notes, the slashed tires, the threats disguised as rules. She handed him a folder, the one she had built out of fear, out of instinct. He listened quietly, took it, and paused when she mentioned the missing footage from the HOA system. Then he said it. "You're not the first one to have trouble with her." Helen didn't blink. "But I'm the last one she'll hurt." At the precinct, Deborah sat in an interview room, arms crossed, eyes defiant. She repeated her line. The dog was aggressive. The girl moved fast. She feared for her life. What she didn't know was that a neighbor had caught everything on their Ring camera. Every word, every frame, every step of Deborah's slow, deliberate walk onto the Blake's property. Her hand reaching into her purse, her voice rising, her eyes never once filled with fear. When the officers showed her the footage, something in her cracked. Her jaw tightened. She looked at the mirror. She asked for a lawyer. But before they left the room, one officer asked, "Do you know who her mother is?" Deborah shook her head. "Some lawyer or something?" "She's a federal judge," he said. "You just shot her daughter in broad daylight. On camera." That was the moment Deborah realized she hadn't just made a mistake. She had detonated her own safety net. There would be no HOA panel to clean this up. No quiet memo. No passive-aggressive note under the mat. It was over. She had played the wrong game with the wrong woman. Back at the hospital, the surgeon came out after what felt like years. Maya was stable. The damage was severe but contained. The bullets had torn through muscle and nerves, but missed her heart, missed her lungs. The long-term effects were unclear. Helen listened, nodded, but inside, something colder had taken root. Not rage, not grief. Focus. She walked into the bathroom, scrubbed the blood from her hands, looked at herself in the mirror, and whispered, "You're going to pay for this." Because Helen knew exactly what came next. This wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about truth, about pattern, about law. And Deborah Wilkins, for all her power and all her polish, was about to learn that justice isn't always a system. It's sometimes a mother with nothing left to lose. Helen Blake didn't cry. Not in the waiting room. Not when the surgeon described the nerve damage. Not when she had to tell Maya that walking again wasn't a question of therapy. It was a question of possibility. Her daughter didn't cry either. She blinked slowly, nodded once, and asked if Charlie was okay. That's who they were. They didn't break. They didn't flinch. They recalibrated. But something inside Helen locked in a place that day. Something sharper than grief. She had seen injustice in every form. She had sentenced men for hate crimes, ruled against corporations that buried discrimination in policy language, dismantled systems that cloaked cruelty in order. She had never been this close to the victim before. And now that she was, the line between judge and mother blurred into something far more dangerous. Purpose. The same night Maya was moved out of intensive care, Helen opened her laptop and created a new folder titled DW Federal Inquiry. The initials were deliberate. No emotion, no theatrics, just facts. She began with what she already had: copies of HOA violation notices, security footage from her own cameras, the Ring video from the neighbor. She backed up everything to encrypted cloud storage, labeled every file with legal tags, compiled a timeline by the hour. This wasn't about proving Deborah had pulled the trigger. That was already public, already indisputable. This was about proving pattern, malice over time, willful harassment, civil rights violations. Helen wasn't building a reaction. She was constructing a federal case. She started making calls. Not to the media. Not yet. She reached out to former clerks, friends in the Department of Justice, a disability rights attorney she'd once co-chaired a symposium with. Every conversation was short, professional, targeted. She wasn't asking for favors. She was asking for eyes, legal, impartial, thorough. She explained the context, shared documents, and one by one, each of them confirmed what she already knew. Deborah Wilkins hadn't just violated HOA policy. She had created a hostile living environment based on disability and race. That wasn't just ugly. It was unlawful. Through a contact at the Office of Civil Rights, Helen gained access to old court records not visible on public search. It took 3 phone calls and a formal request, But within 48 hours, she had Deborah's sealed mediation history from a case 6 years prior. Different neighborhood, different HOA, but the same pattern. Residents who required accommodations reporting ongoing obstruction, notes that skirted legality, neighbors withdrawing support out of fear. The case had settled quietly. Deborah had been asked to resign from that HOA board, but the terms included no public record of wrongdoing. It was buried, forgotten. Until now, Helen didn't stop there. She subpoenaed minutes from recent HOA board meetings, requested transparency logs through the HOA's own bylaws, which, ironically, mandated digital retention for all internal votes and decisions. When the documents arrived, they told a quiet story of targeted pressure. Votes to review non-standard modifications that occurred only after Helen moved in. Board emails discussing aesthetic coherence and neighborhood discomfort. One message, sent from Deborah's personal email to another board member, read, "If she wants to play lawyer, fine. We'll drown her in protocol." Helen flagged that one. She didn't sleep much. But it wasn't adrenaline. It was clarity. She wasn't chasing punishment. She was chasing accountability. Maya had been the target, but she wasn't the only one. This case had to mean something, had to stand for something bigger. She drafted formal complaints with citations, requested an ADA review of Haven Hills through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, initiated a civil suit against the HOA and Deborah as an individual, and quietly looped in the U.S. Attorney's Office with a concise memorandum. Everything she submitted was airtight. No speculation, just provable fact. Deborah wasn't just a rogue neighbor with a gun. She was the architect of a system of intimidation. The HOA scrambled. 2 board members resigned within days. The president pro tem issued a statement that offered regret without admitting guilt. Helen didn't respond. She let the evidence speak. Behind closed doors, attorneys whispered her name with caution. They weren't facing just a grieving mother. They were facing a legal mind with decades of experience and nothing to lose. She was relentless, precise, and completely within her rights. Meanwhile, Maya was recovering. Slowly, she asked more questions now, not about her own condition, but about what would happen to Deborah. Helen answered each one honestly. "She'll be held responsible," she said. "By the law?" Maya asked. "By the law," Helen answered. Maya nodded and said good. That was enough. When the state's special prosecutor contacted Helen to review her files, he didn't request edits. He asked for permission to cite her work in the formal charge brief. She gave it, quietly, no fanfare. That same week, a civil rights coalition reached out asking if Maya would be willing to participate in a public discussion about accessibility and neighborhood equity. Helen let Maya decide. The girl who once cried in silence on their porch now said, "Yeah, I'll do it." Deborah's attorney tried to float a settlement. Money, silence, no admission of guilt. Helen refused. The offer came back higher. She refused again. "I'm not suing for money," she said. "I'm suing for truth." That line ended negotiations. What followed was a slow unspooling of Deborah's influence. News outlets began connecting her name to past incidents. Former neighbors spoke out. A pattern emerged, too clear to ignore. And all of it traced back to one woman who believed policy gave her the right to decide who belonged. In court, Deborah remained composed. Hair perfect, makeup conservative, but her eyes darted. Her hands shook when the ring footage played. When the judge denied her motion to dismiss the federal civil rights claim, her posture collapsed for the first time. Helen didn't smile, didn't flinch. She sat beside Maya and watched as the system Deborah once controlled finally turned against her. Justice didn't roar. It moved like Helen, precise, deliberate, inevitable. Because she wasn't just a mother. She was the one thing Deborah had never accounted for. A judge who didn't need a robe to deliver consequences. A mother who didn't need sympathy to demand change. And a woman who, when the world tried to silence her child, used the law not as a shield, but as a blade. Deborah Wilkins walked into court like she always did, head high, blazer sharp, heels tapping with intent. Her lawyer trailed beside her, a well-paid, overconfident man in an expensive suit who still believed narrative could trump evidence. Deborah thought she had control. She thought this would be another misunderstanding packaged in legal language, tied up with settlement money and buried beneath procedural delays. She didn't realize yet that this wasn't a noise complaint or a zoning dispute. This was a reckoning. She didn't know the footage had already leaked, that the country was watching. She hadn't seen the news anchors replay her face frozen in high definition as she pulled the trigger. She didn't know that the name Helen Blake was trending not as a victim's mother, but as a federal judge who had once sentenced men for crimes smaller than hers. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Civil rights observers, disability advocates, quiet neighbors who used to smile at Deborah and now sat with folded arms and flat stares. Helen was there too, but not in a robe, not at the bench. She sat in the gallery behind Maya's wheelchair, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. Maya was calm, her legs wrapped in a blanket, eyes fixed ahead. She had refused to stay home. She wanted to be there, to hear everything. She didn't flinch when Deborah entered, didn't blink, but her mother saw it, the quiet steel in her gaze, the kind you only earn by surviving the worst day of your life. The prosecutor began with the footage. They didn't save it for drama. They led with it. The video played on the courtroom screen. Deborah approaching the Blake property, her gestures sharp, her tone raised, Charlie barking, Maya trying to calm the situation. Then the gun, the sound of the shots, Maya's body collapsing, the screams, the silence. Deborah didn't look at the screen, but the jury did. The judge did. The room did. And in that silence, something shifted. The air thickened. There was no room left for excuse. Witnesses followed. The neighbor who filmed the incident. The teacher who testified that Maya was friendly, quiet, never aggressive. A former HOA board member who admitted under oath that Deborah had referred to Helen's family as a disruption in private emails. The detective who investigated the case. The civil rights attorney who outlined the federal violations. It was clinical, brutal, layered. But the moment that changed everything didn't come from a lawyer. It came when Helen took the stand. She introduced herself plainly, not as Judge Blake, just as Helen. She spoke with clarity, not emotion. She outlined the timeline, the notes, the threats, the pattern of harassment. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for sympathy. She laid out facts, each one placed with surgical precision. And then she said something that held the room. Deborah Wilkins didn't just fire a weapon that day. She fired every warning we ignored. She pulled the trigger on a system that protected her silence more than it protected my daughter's rights. Deborah's lawyer objected, something about inflammatory language. The judge overruled it. Helen continued. She talked about what it meant to advocate for your child when the system you believe in doesn't believe you back. She talked about how Maya lost her mobility once in an accident, and again at the hands of a woman who mistook a wheelchair for a threat. She ended by turning to the jury, not to beg, but to ask. This isn't about vengeance. It's about whether we still believe that justice applies to everyone, even those who think they're above it. Deborah couldn't hide anymore. She looked small now. Her posture wilted. Her hands trembled slightly as she scribbled notes to her attorney. She knew this wasn't going her way. Her final defense came with a weak tone, a half-baked story about fearing for her safety, about the therapy dogs bark, about being startled. The prosecutor asked one question: how many times did you photograph this family before the incident? Deborah paused, then lied. None. The prosecutor pulled out a printed still from the security footage. Deborah, phone in hand, camera pointed, face focused. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. Deborah saw her narrative collapse. The closing arguments echoed what everyone already knew. The footage didn't lie. The threats weren't imagined. The history wasn't isolated. Deborah hadn't acted in fear. She had acted in entitlement. The jury left. The room breathed. And when they returned, less than 3 hours later, they said the word that Maya had been waiting to hear. Guilty. Guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Guilty of civil rights violations. Guilty of willful harassment against a disabled minor. The sentence came later, but the moment landed now. Helen didn't cry. She didn't nod. She just exhaled slowly, hand still on Maya's shoulder. Deborah turned once as she was escorted out. Her eyes searched the room for someone who still believed her story. There was no one. She locked eyes with Helen, the woman she had once tried to intimidate with bylaws and veiled threats. She expected rage. Helen gave her silence. Because justice doesn't always look like a slammed gavel. Sometimes it looks like a mother holding her daughter's hand in a courtroom she once ruled from, watching the woman who tried to break them walk into the place where no power, no policy, no pretense could save her. Deborah didn't lose because Helen was a judge. She lost because Helen never stopped being one, even when the system asked her to step aside. This wasn't just a trial. It was a message. The law remembers. And when it finally arrives, it leaves no room for disguise. Maya's recovery wasn't fast, and it wasn't clean. There were setbacks, nerve pain that came in waves, sleepless nights, moments when even the strongest smile couldn't hold back frustration. But through it all, she didn't ask, why me? She asked, what now? Her therapist called her progress measured but remarkable. Her mother called it something else, proof. Proof that resilience isn't loud, and strength doesn't always stand tall. Maya didn't just recover. She rebuilt. And when she did, she wasn't interested in returning to what was. She was ready to make something new. At first, it started small, a blog she wrote during rehab about the wheelchair ramp that changed her life. She posted about access, about fear, about being seen as a problem in a place meant to be called home. Other kids commented, some from other cities, some from other hospital rooms. Then came the podcast, a quiet project at first, recorded from the bedroom where she once sat wondering why her neighbors wouldn't wave back. She called it, This Is My Level, and it wasn't about her chair. It was about perspective. She invited guests, other teens with disabilities, parents, teachers, even activists. She asked better questions than most adults ever dared to. Within months, local news picked it up, then state outlets. Then a national segment ran titled, The Girl Who Turned Pain into Policy. Maya wasn't interested in pity. She hated the word inspiration when it came with a tilt of the head and a sad smile. She spoke with clarity, with humor, sometimes with fire. I don't need to be your motivation, she once said in a school assembly. I just need you to move the trash cans off the sidewalk. Her impact didn't come from shock. It came from truth. The kind people didn't want to hear until a kid in a wheelchair made it impossible to ignore. Helen watched all of this unfold, not as a judge, not even as an attorney, but as a mother. And in that role, she finally understood something she had never quite said aloud. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about change, about making sure no other child was left isolated by the quiet cruelty of bureaucracy. Deborah Wilkins would serve her sentence. But Maya? Maya would build a future where people like Deborah didn't get to decide who belonged. There was one moment Helen would never forget. It was at a community panel nearly a year after the verdict. Maya had been invited to speak. The room was packed, families, educators, city officials. At the end of the talk, a man in the audience asked if she ever wished none of it had happened. Maya didn't blink. She looked at her mother, then back at the man, and said, I don't want what happened to define me, but I won't erase it either, because I don't need pity. I need the world to be fair. That's all. She turned to leave, wheeling off stage under her own power, without assistance. That image stuck, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. So if you followed this story to the end, ask yourself, where are the Deborahs hiding in your neighborhood? What quiet corners still allow them to operate? And more importantly, what would you do if it happened to someone you love? If this story moved you, don't just scroll past. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, tell us what justice means to you. And if you believe stories like Maya's deserve to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe to Cracks of Light. We bring you real stories that shine where the world wants to look away. Because some voices don't need to shout, they just need someone to listen.